give it a second. I've got my dogs barking too. So.
Okay, because it's now streaming, so.
Yep, go for it.
Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce this week's Ecology Center seminar speaker, Dr. Pete Marra, who's coming to us from Washington, D.C., where he's currently the director of the Georgetown Environmental Initiative. And let's hope I pronounce this right so the Pope doesn't get mad at me. He's also the Laudato Si Professor of Biology and the Environment at the McCourt School of Public Policy there at Georgetown. Before going to Georgetown, Pete was a research scientist at the Smithsonian for about 20 years, most recently as the director of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. He has a PhD in ecology from Dartmouth, master's in zoology from Louisiana State University, and a BS in biology and chemistry from Southern Connecticut University. Pete has had really an enormously productive career so far. He's started several big research initiatives, the Neighborhood Nest Watch, which is a large urban ecology study in the Washington, D.C. area, the Migratory Connectivity Project. He's authored over 200 scientific papers on topics ranging from community ecology of tropical birds to demography and migration patterns of a wide variety of taxa, including insects and mammals, disease ecology. And as we're going to hear about today, he's really done some good and I'm sure we'll hear somewhat controversial work on the impacts of domestic cats on wildlife. So it's my pleasure to introduce Pete and hand it over to him for what I'm sure will be a very exciting and engaging talk today.
Clark, thank you very much. And really sorry I can't be there in person. Would have really enjoyed a trip out to Utah this time of year. Do some fishing, get to know everyone there. In Georgetown, I'm not around a lot of wildlife ecology people anymore, so I really do miss it. So I'm glad to talk to you all about this. I'm sorry that you got trolled a little bit. Oftentimes when I give these talks in person, I've had a whole suite of different things happen, which is kind of interesting. And I thought I'd start by telling you that I really don't have anything against cats, and that is the truth. I have 2 golden retrievers right now. I used to own a cat named Tookus, and I don't think I'll ever own a cat again, although my wife thinks I should, just so people realize I'm not a cat hater. I came to this problem when I moved to DC, when I moved to the Smithsonian. I had spent my entire career trying to get away from people, trying to go to South America, go to the mountains. Really, I just really wanted to be in as pristine a place as possible. And when I got to Washington, D.C., I realized that I needed to, and starting a family, the whole bit, I realized I needed to start some research that was around my research area where I worked. And so I started this urban ecology project, and I realized that there were so many questions that needed to be asked at this human-wildlife interface that hadn't been asked. And so as soon as I moved there, I started this thing called Neighborhood Nest Watch, where we went in people's backyards and with their help caught birds, color-banded birds, taught them how to find color-banded individual birds and keep track of them over time, find their nests. West Nile virus hit. We began studying the impacts of West Nile virus, but we started studying and looking at a variety of the threats that animals face in these environments. And basically, wherever there's humans, you can't not see that cats are an issue. And that's sort of how I got into this issue. And it became obvious after a while, as you'll see, that the issue really had been with us for a long, long time, and we hadn't been doing anything about it. And it became clear that I just couldn't stop there. But I need to say that, I get it. I understand why there is a problem here, because cats are amazing creatures. They're in our culture. They're loved by millions and millions of people. They exhibit all these really incredibly interesting behaviors. They'll, curl up to your leg and purr. They'll stalk a laser pointer. They'll pounce on a ball of yarn. They'll chase feather toys. I mean, if you like animals or animal behavior, you got to like a cat because they're doing really cool things all the time. And they do this and they'll cuddle on your lap and they'll cuddle around your head. But they do this while they're plotting how they're going to kill you. They do this all at the same time, which also makes it fun. But it also has to remind you that cats are predators. That is what they are. They are predators. And they have these, even though they have these supreme pet-like qualities, they also have these supreme predator-like qualities as well. So while they're in part probably America's favorite pet, they're also a predator and a problem. They reproduce like rabbits with large litters, 2 to 3 per year. When they're left outside, they can be remarkably destructive to wildlife as well as to people. And I'll talk about this today. But I totally understand that cats are doing sort of what comes naturally to them, as natural as anything comes to a cat. But they're pets or they're pests depending upon the situation we put them in. And that's totally clear. I'm not trying to ignore that fact. It is humans that have done this. That I totally get it. But humans have to fix this problem as well. Now, the domestication of the cat is entirely our doing, but they just think they're doing what they should be doing. But again, the consequences of cats are really significant. And their impacts in addition to their impacts on biodiversity, they also have consequences for human health through things like toxo and rabies, and also their own health. Cats outside live half the lifetime or half the survival of cats indoors. So this evening, I'll basically describe the current situation we're in. I'll talk about basically this book that I wrote with my co-author, Chris Santella, Cat Wars. I'll go into all these details and also some of the papers we've written, but not just our papers. I really want to emphasize that there's an enormous literature out there, and a research literature that's been put out there by lots of other people. And I'll emphasize that work as well, because we know enough. We know a lot about this situation, and we should be doing something about it. But that doing something about it brings up this big question. Should we let cats persist outdoor, knowing the consequences, despite these consequences that they have for wildlife and humans? Is it okay, given how destructive they are? So let's do a little bit of background. Let me make sure we're all on the same page so we understand what we're talking about globally. So globally, there are about 40 species of cats. You all probably know the 7 big cats, things like lions and tigers and cougars and snow leopards, panther, you know all those. But there's about 33 species of really fascinating smaller species of cats, things like the serval, the fishing cat, the margay, the flat-headed cat, the sand cat. There's a whole bunch of these really interesting smaller species of cats. This one is Felis sylvestris. It's the wild cat, and it forms a complex group of about 20 different subspecies or so that occur in places like the UK, in Europe, in North Africa, and Asia. And the domestic cat is thought to have been domesticated from a group of around 5 of these wildcat subspecies. So this is a picture of the European wildcat. And there are just a few populations remaining in Scotland that it's thought to be less than 100. I've heard some people say that they're not even sure any pure European wildcats still exist, but they do occur in France and Germany, pure in Scotland, that is. They do occur in France and Germany and Switzerland. And in many cases, they're critically endangered. And they've been sort of brought to their knees by things like habitat loss, but also by this inbreeding with domestic cats and the diseases that they carry. How did the domestication actually happen? Well, nobody knows for sure, but it's thought to have happened around 10,000 years ago. That was the time when humans started to store grains, store water, build houses. And when you do that, you start to attract things like birds and small rodents. And if there are any predators nearby, they also tend to move into those areas to feed on those small birds and rodents. And about 10,000 years ago, there's evidence of domestic cat bones in grave sites. And so they've been dated out back to around 10,000 years. Domestic dogs are much older. And so cats are a much more recent domestication, it's thought. Cats are deeply embedded in our cultural history. When you look at sculptures of Rome and Greece, you can see all kinds of evidence of cats being domesticated then. This is a picture painted by Pablo Picasso, a famous painting from 1939 called Cat Catching Bird. Picasso is credited as saying he was obsessed by cats. In a little bit, you'll probably see that there was actually a disease component to that possession. But he left us many, many paintings of cats in his 50,000 or so paintings that he left us. Mark Twain loved cats and wrote about cats. Ernest Hemingway, if you've ever been to one of Hemingway's houses in either Cuba or in Florida, you still see descendants of Hemingway's cats that are on the property that he owned. And of course, they're also in our popular culture. Felix the cat, Morris, Grumpachino, or Grumpy the cat. There's a coffee drink named Grumpachino. So they are totally in our culture, embedded in our culture, not just our pets, but they're in our cartoons, they're in our art, they're in our music. We're surrounded by cats, which makes this human-wildlife conflict even more complex. But the thing that you need to remember is that Felis domesticus, the domestic cat, is just like a sheep, a cow, a dog, a chicken, a pig, and a rabbit. They are domesticated. They are created by humans. They are, or things that humans have done. They don't occur in any natural habitat anywhere, right? They are, and it's one of the only ones that are allowed to roam free. Not the only one, but it's one of the only domesticated animals that are allowed to roam as free as they do. And it's a global problem. This is not just a US problem. This is a global problem. I know that there's a huge horse problem in the West and also in the East in Chesapeake Bay and an island off of Canada. But globally, this is a tremendous, tremendous problem. I'll talk a lot about the US, but just know it's worldwide. There are a lot of cats. In the United States, there are roughly 90 million owned cats, and we have a pretty good estimate of that. And it's roughly 66% of these that go outside. That's an old estimate. I don't know if it's any higher or any lower. I'd like to think that that number is a little lower. And so that means there are about 60 million cats that are owned that are allowed to go outside. And the way we typically classify domestic cats are they're either owned or they're unowned. And then there are ones that are feral. And feral cats are ones that are not affiliated or not dependent on humans in any way, shape, or form. In the US, we think there are roughly between 60 to 100 million unowned cats. And we don't really know how many feral cats there actually are in the US. There aren't any really good estimates. But I do know that there are roughly 40 national parks that claim to have problems with cats. And some of those are urban parks. Some of those are pristine or somewhat pristine natural parks. So that means there's somewhere between 80 to 160 million owned and unowned outdoor cats. We typically use estimates between 30 million and 80 million when we're building our models, always on the side of caution and being really conservative with those estimates. And in all the models I'll talk about today, when we try to estimate impacts, we actually use that really low number of 30 million. And when you hear or read critics of our work, they don't ever mention that we're really using this extremely low number to estimate the number of cats that are actually out in the world. At the same time, in North America, there are somewhere between 750 and 800 regularly occurring native species of birds, species like woodpeckers and cuckoos and scarlet tanagers and hawks and sparrows and grosbeaks and flycatchers and hummingbirds and swallows and swifts. And I was part of a paper that was published a little over, I guess in 2019, year and a half ago, that reported that we're seeing about 57% of these species declining significantly. We've lost about a third of our species, overall numbers of birds in the last 50 years. So we're dealing with a real, I would say, conservation crisis. We're watching the process of the sixth mass extinction occur before our very eyes. And invasive species are one of the drivers of those declines. Habitat loss is by far the most important thing. But we can't just be focused on one of these factors. We need to deal with multiple factors when we start addressing these problems. And invasive species and cats are one of those issues. The cerulean warbler would be one of these examples. The cerulean warbler is the species that breeds in the Appalachians in the east up to southern Canada, from like Tennessee to southern Canada, and it migrates down to the eastern front of the Andes. That's a species that's lost about 75% of its population since around 1970. Piping plover is another one. This is a species that breeds along coastal areas, not just on marine coastal areas, but also along the Great Lakes. And this is a species that is definitely can be impacted by cats. In fact, there are cat colonies near breeding colonies of piping plovers. This is a species that has been endangered and threatened depending upon the population. Some of these have been removed from the endangered list. Some remain as threatened. So today I'm going to talk about the consequences. What's the evidence for the consequences? When we think about consequences, what does that really mean? I'll talk about potential solutions to these consequences. And then I'll talk about the cat wars, the battles between the peoples that defend the single domesticated species, the cat, and the people that are sort of trying to support native species, ecosystems, people like myself. That is also I consider myself an animal advocate, actually. So let's begin. Take a sip of water. So put yourself back in the late 1800s, actually. Let's make it 1894 to be specific. There's no email, there's no text messaging, there's no planes. In fact, there's not even any lights. There's no cars. So if you wanted to move around the planet, you pretty much did it with a boat. And in most cases, it was a wooden boat. And shipping was a major mode of transport. And because a lot of these boats were wooden, as they came into port, they depended on lighthouses to guide them into port. Otherwise, they could hit rocks, and if you hit a rock, it likely was going to rip a big hole in your boat, and you could have sailors drowning because many of these people could not swim. And so, as one story goes, this had happened, in fact, near Stevens Island in New Zealand, and the New Zealand Maritime Agency, having to deal with 3 major shipwrecks in this area, decided to put a lighthouse up on Stevens Island. And one lighthouse keeper by the name of David Lyall went out there with his wife and at least one child and apparently a cat named Tibbles. David Lyall also happened to be an amateur naturalist and could put up museum specimens and knew most of the birds of New Zealand. And within just a few months, he noticed his cat was bringing in a species that he had never seen before. This specimen right here, now known as the Stevens Island wren. It was identified as a new species within 6 months of him being out there. And within 9 months, it was determined that it had gone extinct on the island of Stevens Island. No more specimens were being brought in by Tibbles the cat. And it turns out there were probably more than just one cat out there. Tibbles either came out there pregnant or there were somebody else had brought out cats, but the island was crawling in cats. When you read some of the newspaper clippings from back in the day, they claimed that this was a record rate of extinction, and that Stevens Island was just crawling in cats a year and a half later. I wish I could say that was the first and only species to go extinct because of cats, but I can't. And I would also say that in some of these cases, it's caused entirely by cats. In other cases, and probably the majority of cases, cats are contributing to the extinction of the species. When my book came out, we had reported on a paper that was published that said there were 33 species that went extinct because of cats. After my book was published, a guy by the name of Doherty from Australia published a paper just a month after the book came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy that attributed 63 species extinctions, 2 reptiles, 40 birds, and 21 mammals to cats, second only to rats for total extinctions around the planet. Some of these are just extinct in the wild, like the Socorro Island dove. Thankfully, they're working to try to release that species back on Socorro Island once they've removed all the cats and the sheep, trying to restore that habitat. But that's a pretty significant number of animals to have gone extinct because of a single species. So that's sort of the first line of evidence that there's probably a significant problem here. But we can also ask a slightly different question, which I did with a postdoc by the name of Scott Loss and a colleague from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Tom Will, and basically ask, what's the magnitude of mortality imposed by cats relative to other sources of mortality? If we're going to put our energy into something, should we try to get the cat people to keep their cats indoors or stop trap, neuter, return? Or should we really focus on wind turbines or power lines or automobiles? So we got this grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try to estimate, build a model to look at this. And we basically asked the question is how does direct human-caused bird mortality compare to other sources? And we came up with a way to do this. There had been a few other estimates out there, but they didn't have any uncertainty around those estimates. And what we decided to do, what Scott really did, was to gather as many papers as he possibly could for each of these individual sources of mortality, and basically looked at how many birds, reptiles, amphibians, or rodents were reported in each of these studies to be brought in by owned cats or unowned cats, and built a model with the total number of cats to look at sort of total annual mortality caused by owned cats versus unowned cats to try to get at the magnitude of mortality. He did a similar thing for wind turbines and power lines and other things as well. When you do that, what you find is that in the US, we were able to estimate that 2.4 billion birds are killed. This is the median estimate. And there's a range from about 1.3 to 4.3 billion birds per year that are killed by cats. Most of this mortality is by unowned cats, but there's still a significant number that are killed by free-ranging cats. And as extreme as this number seems, the low end of 1.3 billion was actually a back of the envelope estimate done by a colleague in California years ago, using just mortality caused by owned cats. So it's really, it's as large as it seems, it's actually not that amazing. It's not that strange. So it's 1.3 to 4 billion birds per year. What about mortality of other wildlife taxa? Well, we estimate that cats kill many more mammals, since most of those mammals aren't flying, so not including bats, I suppose, 12.3 billion mammals, and hundreds of millions of reptiles and amphibians. Cats are opportunistic predators, and they also take lots and lots of insects. I know this is a tough figure to see, but it's a really important point. This is looking at the other types of mortality out there. So cats, buildings, and windows, so collisions, automobiles, power lines, communication towers, all the way down to wind turbines. And what's interesting here is that in addition to the difference in the magnitudes, Canada was doing a very similar analysis, unbeknownst to us initially, trying to look at this magnitude question. And before we started this process and before Canada started this process, buildings and windows were thought to be the number one killer at close to this 500 million per year. Cats were at around 250 million per year. After we both did this analysis, cats flipped in both cases. And you can see the magnitude of mortality in the US is about 5 times that of what it is for cats versus buildings. And in Canada, it's even worse for cats versus buildings. But the relative impacts are pretty much the same across both countries. So we've got species extinctions, we've got massive magnitude of mortality, but still, the question that lots of folks pose, including groups in bird conservation organizations, not just here in the US, but also the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in the UK, folks in the National Audubon Society, US Fish and Wildlife Service, will come out and still say, but they're not having population level impacts. They eat primarily the weak and the chafe. There's very little evidence for population level impacts. Well, that's just not true. Every one of those extinctions, it turns out, is actually a population level impact. But even on top of that, there's other ways that cats are having population level impacts. And there's several studies. In fact, we wrote a paper for Frontiers that summarize all those population level impacts. And you can look that up. It's a Loss and Marra paper in Frontiers. I'm going to just talk about one of these examples, but again, there's several, and not just in the US. This is one of the most famous ones that I point to by Kevin Crooks and Michael Soule. It was published in the journal Nature. So that previous paper I was referring to that talked about the number of extinctions was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, pretty good journal. This one was published in Nature, also a pretty good journal. Our magnitude paper was published in Nature Communications. So I'm pointing this out again to emphasize that this information has gotten out there. There's lots of information, but there's also a massive amount of pushback by the cat advocates about there not being any good science on this issue. There's lots of good science on this issue. So what Kevin Crooks and Michael Soule did was they looked at cats and coyotes in large fragments in Southern California and small fragments in Southern California. And they didn't look at forest fragments. They were looking at grassland fragments that were surrounded by houses. But in these large grassland fragments, they actually supported a pretty healthy predator population of coyotes. Turns out coyotes have a sweet tooth for cats. And in the smaller fragments, there wasn't a coyote issue there. So cat populations did really well. And what they found was that in the small fragments, because there were no coyotes, the cat populations thrived, and most of these were own cats. And they did an incredible job of looking at what the cats were eating and then also measuring bird population response. And they showed in those small fragments that the bird population diversity, the population diversity was much lower. In fact, there were several species that were not present in those small fragments, and the abundance was lower compared to the large fragments where the coyotes were removing these mesopredators in those, the high densities of these cats. In those large fragments where the coyotes were present, the bird diversity was higher and the overall abundance of birds was also much higher. Clearly a demonstration of population level impacts. Really wonderful demonstration. Now I wish I could stop there, but it's clear there are population level impacts that are additive, additive form of mortality. There's a large magnitude relative to other forms of anthropogenic mortality. And there are species extinctions around the globe caused from cats, not just on islands, also on mainland areas. But that's not all. There's also diseases that cats transmit to humans and wildlife that also cause problems. So through indirect means. This is a picture of a human eye. And that scar that you see right there is actually a toxoplasma scar. Toxoplasma gondii is this fascinating protozoan parasite that breeds only in the guts of cats. So to be clear, if we didn't have cats, we would not have Toxoplasma gondii. If we didn't have domestic cats, that should be clear. Toxoplasma gondii, there are different forms that occur in things like panthers and tigers and other types of cats. But we have enormous amounts of toxo in our environment because of the high density of cats in our environment. Now, let me explain a little bit about how toxoplasma works, about the life cycle of Toxoplasma gondii. So again, Toxoplasma gondii breeds sexually only in the stomachs of cats. Cats will then spew feces for about a week or two, and they can spread hundreds of millions or millions of these oocysts, these fecal oocysts. Think of them as eggs. And these eggs, these oocysts can exist and persist in the environment for up to a year. They are these incredibly resilient things that can last in dry soil, in wet soil, in frozen soil, in fresh water, in marine environments. So they spread almost like styrofoam and plastic does around our globe. So if you've got a cat colony, those oocysts can spread into the marine on land. They can spread into the marine environment pretty readily. And this has been demonstrated multiple times in multiple ways. But how this parasite works, and it's really fascinating if you're not familiar with this, the idea here is that this cat will shed these oocysts and they'll get picked up by a mouse. And these oocysts then are eaten by the mouse and it moves right to the brain. It actually goes into two different forms, goes to the brain and triggers an endocrine response that changes the behavior of the mouse. And that mouse goes from being afraid of cats to being attracted to cats. It's called sort of the fatal attraction disease. And this has been shown in some really elegant experiments Same thing with birds. And the whole idea here is that protozoan parasite, by causing that new host to be attracted to cats, it actually can then be that rodent gets preyed upon by another cat, and that protozoan parasite gets to breed sexually once again in a new cat host, not just an intermediate host. And so it's really a brilliant parasite. The problem is there's lots of unintended hosts, including humans, but also wildlife. And it are these unintended hosts that pick up these Toxoplasma oocysts in a variety of ways. Primarily, we think through our diet, because lots of cats occur on farms and near vegetables, near our livestock. When we don't cook our meat, we ingest these oocysts, and we get these lifelong infections that also occur to our brains. Sometimes those oocysts migrate down to our eyes and cause scars like you saw in that picture before. So an ocular toxoplasma scar. Next time you go to your eye doctor, ask your eye doctor how often they see scars on people's eyes caused by toxo. It does cause blindness. We've known about this problem for a long time. If you have been pregnant, or if you plan on being pregnant, you'll be told by your doctor that you should not change the kitty litter, that you should not spend too much time near your cat, and you should definitely not garden because of the risks of being exposed to Toxoplasma oocysts and the risk that has for causing a premature miscarriage or other problems with the fetus. We've gotten this under control in most developed countries. In many developing countries, this is still a significant problem. We now know that despite what people have said, that if you have toxo infections, first of all, it is a lifelong illness. You don't get rid of it. Some people do continue to have problems with it, but there's ways to treat it that are very expensive. Toxoplasma was one of the primary killers of people with AIDS early in the AIDS crisis. But we now know there's lots of other problems that are caused that are sublethal with toxo. And I'll just talk about one of these, but you should know that there's now evidence to suggest it's correlated to the frequency of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, a whole suite of different cancers. There's a lot of different issues out there with toxo. And it's thought in the US, somewhere between 15 and 20% of all people are infected with toxo. It's thought to be the #1 foodborne illness in the world. 30% of the world is thought to be infected with toxo. That number seems a little high to me, but that's what people are saying. I'm going to talk about one study. And again, there's enormous literature about toxo and its impacts on humans, including several meta-analysis. And I suggest you either go directly to the primary literature if you don't believe me, or there's also a really good article in The Atlantic called "Your Cat is Making You Crazy" that summarizes a lot of this research on Toxoplasma gondii infection. So I'll talk about one study done in Denmark that looked at around 45,000, 46,000 Danish women whose level of Toxoplasma antibodies was measured in connection with childbirth between 1992 and 1995. And what they found was that women with Toxo gondii infections that were positive were 2 times more likely to commit suicide than those that weren't. As I mentioned, there is a clear indication between things like bipolar disorder, depression, and toxo infection in humans. I wish I could say the problem was only with humans, but toxo gets into enormous numbers of wildlife species, including the Hawaiian monk seal. I was talking to somebody earlier today, one of your grad students who has done work on Hawaii, and she was bringing up the problem of cats in Hawaii, and Hawaii is crawling in cats. And all those cats, their feces are just left throughout the forest. And if there are infected cats with toxo, which there are, that toxo gets into the marine ecosystem, clings onto those oocysts, cling onto prey items that are eaten by monk seals. And the monk seals, if they get oocysts in them, it's deadly. And so there are enormous numbers of, or not enormous numbers, but a significant number of Hawaiian monk seals that have died because of oocysts, Toxoplasma gondii oocyst ingestion. But things like Hawaiian goose, Hawaiian crow, red-footed boobies, francolins, there's a whole suite of marine mammals like dolphins amongst the monk seals. Also sea otters, Toxoplasma gondii in California is a real problem for sea otters. 16% of mortality of sea otters is caused by Toxoplasma gondii, the #1 killer of endangered sea otters. So lots of evidence, and I'm not going to even talk about the other diseases like rabies and other problems, but there's a whole suite of other diseases, including plague. It's not a huge number, but plague is dispersed to humans periodically by exposure to cats because they're preying on rodents that have plague. But let's now talk a little bit about some of the solutions. Right when my book came out, my colleague and I, my friend Chris Santel and I, published an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, basically, trying to advertise the book, but making the argument that, when I was a kid, and probably when many of you were kids, dogs roam free too. And we got it under control, in part because dogs were the primary way we got rabies from domesticated animals. There were lots of dog bites. And dogs were getting hit by cars. And so we started to enact leash laws. We started to put licensing into place. And so we just made this argument that it's about time we take pet responsibility more seriously and start to treat cats like dogs. And that's all we argued. But that's really what this is. And that same day, I happened to go to a bar with my wife where I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And our waitress comes up to us and basically says, I'm a crazy cat person. I don't know why she said this. I don't know. She didn't know who I was. And I said, I hope you don't, like I do all the time. I said, I hope you don't have your cat outside. And she said, not anymore, because I used to. And my first cat was killed by a coyote. My second cat was killed by a car, which is the #1 way cats are killed when they're outside. Now I keep my cat on a leash here, and she showed me pictures. She gave me these pictures. His name is Mustachio, because you can see he's got a little, AKA Moose. He's got a little mustache. And you're not going to go out running with your cat like you might with your dog, but she taught her cat how to stop at the sidewalk, how to walk. And the cat is able to go outside and get enriched, because that's what we want to do. We want our animals to be enriched. And if you own a cat, you have a responsibility to provide some stimulation for that cat. So it is being enriched. So putting cats on leashes is actually becoming a little bit more in vogue than it used to. The other thing that's changing, in addition to walking cats, catios are also starting to become much more popular, especially in places like in Portland and San Antonio, where I've given this talk and talked about this issue. There are now wine and catio tours because people are starting to take this more seriously. In this way, cats can be safely enclosed, but they can watch outside. They can see a bird or a lizard or a mouse and become enriched by that, but not actually go kill it. And so we need to do more of these sorts of things for our own cats. It's really critical. And we also need to put in more licensing laws and leash laws out there as well. So the own cats, there's very little excuse for why people that own cats continue to let their cats outside. I'm sorry, most wildlife professionals agree on that. The real problem and the real wars start when we start talking about these outdoor unowned cats, how to deal with these, the somewhere between 30 to 60 to 100 million of these unowned outdoor cats. It's a tremendous wildlife problem here, because what we're doing, folks, is just not working. And this has been a problem for over 100 years. We've known of this problem. There's lots in my book, I talk about the variety of scientists that have talked about this problem going back to not just 1894, but also in the early 1900s, 1960s. This has been a known problem. And what we're doing is just not working for the people and for the cats. And this is all fueling these cat wars. People that should be on the same side are on totally opposite sides. And there's a number of things we can do here. And there are some things we agree on. The first two things that we all agree on is that we have to spay and neuter as many cats as possible. That's a known, we have to do that. The second thing is we have to really stop pet abandonment. And you might say that, is pet abandonment really that big of a problem? Well, actually it is. There's a lot of people that, especially in places like universities and military campuses, or people that are forced to adopt cats that aren't really ready to adopt cats. And then they realize, well, we can't do this. And they see somebody feeding cats over there, and this cat was doing fine outside, and they decide just to leave the cat because they think the cat will be fine. And so pet abandonment and spaying and neutering are two things that we really need to do to help solve the cat problem. But the other thing that most cat groups, cat advocacy groups, are advocating for is something called trap, neuter, return. And this is growing, unfortunately. And what I'm going to argue here is that there's a complete lack of empirical support for it, but that essentially it's just another form of pet abandonment that is just not working for cats or for wildlife. And I'm going to go through a study that basically is used to argue that, in fact, it is working. This study was published in, I don't remember where it was actually published, but it was published. The lead author is a woman by the name of Julie Levy. She's at the University of Florida. And it was, when it was published, it was an 11-year study. And it started off with 155 cats from 1991 to 2002. Well, she immediately adopted out 73 cats, 47%, which she counted as part of the trap, neuter, return study. Well, any student would know that is not a trap, neuter, return study. That's a trap, neuter, adopt study. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm using 82 as the starting point for a trap, neuter, return study. That's a different, I love the adoption. That's fantastic. And if this shows how well you can actually adopt out cats, that's great. But we're trying to understand about the efficacy of TNR. 17 cats were immediately euthanized out of those 82, which should say something about the condition these cats are in when the study first started. And some would probably argue that there were more that could have been euthanized. 10 were found dead, 6 were killed by cars, 4 they couldn't figure out what killed them. Getting killed by cars is not really a natural way to die. In my opinion, maybe it is. I don't think so. 32 tend to be lost. I don't know where they went. This was a sort of a controlled study. They either just went to another colony, or more than likely, they were probably hit by a car. But in many cases, when something's hit on the road, it runs and then it bleeds out somewhere. So after 11 years, there were 23 remaining cats. This was in 2002. I gave this talk in 2016 on a worldwide vet, like a global vet seminar online. There were a lot of vets online. And Julie Levy was one of the vets. And she saw me give this presentation and go through her stats. And she said, Dr. Marra, or Pete, I don't know what you called me. She's basically said, it's, I forget, I can't do the math, 12. It's now 20 something years afterwards, and we're down to 9 cats. And I'm like, really? 20 something years, and it's still actually 30 something years, and you still have cats on the landscape in this intensively controlled situation? How is that success? I don't think that's success. And so we've reviewed all these examples, and there might be declines, but the devil's in the details when you start looking at the studies. In this case, you've got vets that are really doing a lot of the work. In most cases, you don't have vets involved in the monitoring and the capturing of cats. You've got really concerned citizens, people that are cat lovers doing the work that have no training in wildlife biology or biology of cats. Plus, it's inhumane to leave these cats outside. Not only do they get hit by cars, they get diseases, they get preyed upon, all sorts of things happen to them. How is this a humane way to treat cats? And it's because of this reason that groups like PETA, that I normally would not align myself with, are totally against TNR. That's right. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, are totally against all these cat advocacy groups. So you've got this other side to this whole battle and this whole war that is in there that makes this, from a theoretical perspective, quite interesting. The other part of this is that if you really want populations to decline, you have to neuter a minimum of 75%, depending upon the immigration and emigration rate, but more like 90% for there actually to be eventually attrition to zero. But this doesn't happen. Immigration continues into the colony because they encourage cat dumping for the reasons I just described and other reasons. And it's not even scratching the surface. The other part of this is, how are we evaluating the success of TNR? Why is it just about cats? It should be about the ecosystem. It's not just about saving cats' lives. It should also be about what cats are doing to the rest of the community. All that being said, I acknowledge that not all areas are equal with respect to the potential impacts that cats can have in certain systems or in certain areas. And so, and we're not going to just get rid of TNR overnight. It's just not going to happen. So I feel like there's almost got to be some compromise. So one approach that I'm thinking about is that, well, in low impact areas, areas where there's really a low potential impact on biodiversity and for the spread of disease, that means no TNR colonies in elementary schools with sandboxes. And yes, there are TNR colonies around elementary schools with sandboxes. We need to confirm that by biologists and then ensure maximum sterilization rates and vaccinations with boosters, and then do a regular and proper census methodology to demonstrate that there is a decline meeting population objectives. You might be surprised at this, but I've never seen these things articulated anywhere for a TNR colony. These are not management systems. These are just, do it as we can kinds of systems. And I would say at the same time, in any high priority conservation area, and every state has them, I would argue the entire state of Hawaii is one, every county has them, every city has them, there has to be a no tolerance system for cats. We can't tolerate cats in these areas at all. They have to be removed. What do we do with cats in these areas? Well, maybe we adopt some of them out. The problem is that for some of these older cats, they're just not adoptable. They will not eventually tame again. For younger cats, they can be tamed. This has been demonstrated over and over again. But for the older cats, it just doesn't work. Another potential solution then is to put them into cat sanctuaries. But folks, you're going to have to fence off the entire state of Rhode Island for this cat sanctuary if you hope to do that. And then there's the feces and what to do with the feces. And then there's also the issue of the food that's required and the protein demand to produce that food, because it's pretty much all protein. So this is really not a reasonable solution. So that brings us to one other solution that we don't like to talk about. It's an alternative, but it's one we have to address. And from a wildlife biology perspective, it's one we are forced to think about. And sometimes there's no better solutions. It happens in the US, in fact, every year. I'm not suggesting that this be the reality for all cats, but many vets would argue that this is probably the better option given the mess we're in. And we are in a mess. Just putting cats back on the landscape where they impact wildlife, people, and themselves is just not a reasonable solution. So we have to have this conversation more and more. It might be the only solution that we really have in some situations. So we're left with this ecological and animal welfare dilemma. And it's frankly turned into a war. Even tonight at this talk here, several people emailed in complaining about me talking this evening. I've had protests, multiple death threats over the years because of my work, my science on cats. I'm not attacking anybody. I'm merely presenting the science. And these cats are not between me, and the wars are not between me and cats or cats and wildlife. The wars are between people and these refutations of what the science are telling us and the importance of the cats and defending these cats. And it's mainly because it does boil down to killing one animal to save another. But it's not saving one other, it's saving many other animals. And that's the reality. And it's something we have to come to grips with. Australia has already come to grips with this. In fact, in 2016, they announced the 2 million cat cull, because in Australia, they realized that they've already lost many species to other native species, to other invasive species. So if we want cats off the landscape, we're going to have to come up with some good solutions for doing this. And we've dealt with problems like this before, and that's the reason I'm hopeful. Who would have thought we would have stopped smoking in bars and restaurants, or seen things like gay marriage, or even turn the needle on climate change? We shouldn't let the fact that this seems like such a giant obstacle get in the way of continuing to take on this challenge. We really need to do it, and we need to bring it to decision makers, and it's really on us to do this. We've known about this problem for a long, long time, And it's really in our best interest. It's in our wildlife's best interest, and it's in our children's best interest to make a difference here and to solve this problem. So I'll stop there. I'll gladly take some questions. Hopefully that was clear.
All right.